Today's first speaker will be Chika Okafor. And as Chika speaks, if you have questions, you can leave them in the Q&A section. There will be 1 minute or so for questions after the talk. The title of Chika's talk is Prosecutor Politics, the Impact of Election Cycles on Criminal Sentencing in the Era of Rising Incarceration. Chika, go for it.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Chika Okafor, and I'm an economics PhD candidate at Harvard and a JD graduate of Yale Law School. I want to start off by grounding us on some very basic facts. First, as we can see, there was a very rapid increase in the number of incarcerated individuals in the US, which began around 1980. Also, there is this quote from a former Supreme Court justice that holds that the prosecutor has more control over life, liberty, and reputation than any other person in America. This introduces a very basic question on the relationship between prosecutors and this rise in incarceration. 3 points to consider. First, as we saw on the last slide, state and federal prisoners grew by over 600% between 1970 and 2000. In addition to the actual lives spent in prison, this has led to significant costs for state governments. Around $81 billion annually is spent for prison, parole, and probation alone. Second, among practitioners, prosecutors are widely considered the most powerful and influential actor in the US criminal justice system. They have nearly unfettered authority on whether or not to charge a suspect with a crime, as well as on the collection of crimes to charge them with. Also, they are a key factor in plea bargaining. Despite what we learn from TV shows, most people who are charged with crimes never see a trial. They never see a judge nor a jury for sentencing. Instead, they plead guilty with the terms of their plea deal brokered by the prosecutor. About 95% of criminal trials are decided via plea bargain, not by trial. Third, chief local prosecutors, who I call district attorneys throughout this presentation, lead the prosecutor's office in a district or county. In these offices, they set the tone, they set the culture, they set the policy. And importantly, in nearly all US states, this position is elected. This introduces my main research question. My study seeks to address the following questions. How do political incentives affect the decisions of district attorneys? Specifically, this project explores how election cycles impact criminal sentencing outcomes, attempting to isolate whether the election year effects are due to changes in DA behavior as opposed to the behavior of other actors in the criminal justice system. Also, I explore various mechanisms behind these findings across geographies, political ideology, and local public sentiment toward crime. Now let us talk about the data and empirical model used in the project. The main outcome data come from the National Corrections Reporting Program. The 2 main outcome variables I use are admissions per thousand population and sentence month per thousand population. Sentence months correspond with the total maximum sentence. The election data comes from various sources and covers state legislature, attorney general, other state office, and US congressional races. The total number of prosecutors in my data is about 4,200 and roughly cover the years of the steepest rise in US incarceration from 1985 to 2005. Now, my main empirical strategy is to look at criminal sentencing outcomes and their relationship to district attorney election cycles. County-level variation in the timing of DA elections provides substantial variation across counties that I exploit using a series of dynamic difference and differences specifications. In my analysis, about half of elections happen in presidential election years, 40% happen in midterm years, and 10% happen in odd number years. I limit my analysis to states with elected DAs who have 4-year terms, which covers 41 of 50 states in the union. Here, I evaluate the expression either with time periods in months or in years. Y corresponds to one of 2 outcome variables, either admissions per capita or total sentence months per capita. In all the charts that follow, I normalize the results around a particular time period and set those betas equal to 0. And so the coefficients of interest are all the betas except beta for the normalized time period. Now, in this section, I will show some early results. Here we have criminal sentencing outcomes relative to the time period 2 years prior to a DA election. All graphs I show on the following slides include controls for white share of the population and for per capita income. The shape of the graph is preserved even if these controls are removed. Now, this graph shows outcomes in log points, which approximates the percentage change. And as I mentioned, the results are normalized around the time period corresponding to 2 years prior to an election year. Since individual criminal cases are generally unrelated to each other, it is reasonable to interpret each dot as a collection of independent observations. Thus, the fact that the dots are close together and increasing in the period immediately preceding a general election suggests that there is, in fact, an increasing trend occurring during this time period. Now, this plot shows sentence month per capita for property offenses. One can clearly see that all the estimates during the election year are greater than 0, which is not the case for the time periods before and after the election year. And it's also not true for the time period omitted from the graph, since that period has been normalized to 0. Also, one can see that the estimates immediately following the election year have the greatest concentration of estimates below 0, which is consistent with the perspective that political incentives and their impact on prosecution may be lowest just after an election concludes. Now, this plot shows the admissions rate per capita across all offenses. Again, we see a clear, consistent upward trend in the outcome variable from about 12 months prior to the election through the middle of the election year. In this next graph, we see the same plot for sentence months per capita across all offenses. Again, the same trend persists. In the election year, there appears to be a jump in sentence months, and it appears the lowest estimates occur in the year immediately following the election, which is the period on the far right that has the greatest concentration of negative estimates. Now, recent papers have discussed potential pitfalls when two-way fixed effects models have treatments that occur in multiple years. Sun and Abraham proposed one methodology for an alternative estimator, which would be robust to this potential issue. In using this methodology, I normalize all estimates this time against the election year. So negative values for the CATT estimates correspond with the positive impact from being in an election year compared against non-election years. You can see that the reweighted estimates remain negative for both outcome variables across all crime categories. For the all offense estimates, the coefficients remain statistically significant under this alternative weighting methodology. Furthermore, the magnitude of the coefficients for the all offense estimates are not too different from what I find in the original specification. Now, one might think these findings might be due to other elections that might be happening at the same time as district attorney elections. To test for this, as one robustness check, I perform a similar analysis, this time removing all district attorney election cycles in which the election year is synchronous with those of other elected offices, such as mayors and sheriffs. In this slide, negative values correspond with a positive election year effect on outcomes. Here, the same trend persists. Election year outcomes are higher than those of non-election years when removing election cycles where the DA election was synchronous with mayoral or sheriff elections, and the effects are statistically significant. Now, note that this analysis only covers cases in which I could confirm either yes or no that the elections were synchronous. I've been able to gather much more data on sheriff elections than on mayoral elections, and I've been able to classify in over 60% of county year combinations whether or not the DA election is synchronous with the sheriff election. This plot shows estimates of the effects of DA election cycles on per capita arrest rates and per capita crime rates, using a regression specification that looks at years instead of months. If anything, the election year volume of arrests and crimes are slightly lower than in non-election years, though for the most part, the difference is not statistically significant. Now, this plot is important because it suggests that the main election effects on sentencing outcomes are not explained by changes in the volume of arrests or crimes around elections. It provides evidence against the potential perspective that the DA election year effects are attributable to changes in criminal behavior or police presence or the behavior of other elected officials. In short, this plot is consistent with the notion that the election year increases in sentencing outcomes is in fact attributable to changes in district attorney behavior. Now that we've seen evidence that there is an increase in the admissions rate per capita and the total month sentence per capita as general elections approach, I'll provide a very short introduction of the potential mechanisms that are described in more depth in the paper. So one step to try to better understand the mechanisms is to standardize a variety of different county characteristics and then interact them with the election year effects. This chart shows the association between standardized county characteristics and the election year effects based on a static difference in differences model. All characteristics represent the mean value from 1986 to 2006. The red vertical line represents the main effect, the election year effect in the absence of the interaction termed with the county characteristics. What we see is that a 1 standard deviation increase in the total crime rate is associated with a 5 log point increase in election year effects for both outcomes. The relative significance of total crime rate is consistent with the perspective that greater crime rates impact public opinion, perhaps by galvanizing the public against criminal suspects, which in turn might increase the pressure that prosecutors face in being harsher on crime. This chart also shows the Democratic vote share, which measures the fraction of votes going to the Democratic presidential candidate in the prior election, is the second most influential county characteristic in the chart. It is negatively associated with the election year effects, and it is significant for both outcomes. The fact that the political ideology of the district is associated with election year effects is consistent with the notion that it is public opinion or the public's general sentiment toward crime that may be influencing district attorneys. Now, if this perspective is true, then one would reasonably expect this effect to have changed over time. We are no longer in the tough on crime era of the 1980s and 1990s, for example. In the 1980s and 1990s, anecdotally, there was a lot more talk and perhaps perceived benefit from being a politician who was viewed as being tough on crime. This was a period of the spike in crack-related drug convictions, the passing of the 1994 crime bill, and the establishment of minimum sentencing laws around the country. The General Social Survey, which is a longitudinal sociological survey administered yearly, shows that in fact, the vast majority of the population believed courts were not harsh enough. The shaded region corresponds with the approximate time coverage of the core empirical analysis in this study. Only after 1994 did the fraction of the population begin to decline who believed courts were not harsh enough. In contrast, those who believed courts were too harsh have become a growing share of the population since about 1994. In short, public sentiment toward punishment has been shifting over the last 25 years or so. I plan to perform additional analysis to see how public sentiment might be related to the election year effects I showed earlier in this presentation. Now to conclude. So in closing, one thing I would like to mention is that this project only evaluates the short-term cyclical impact of being in an election year on sentencing outcomes. It does not capture potential longer-term political considerations that might impact how DAs approach their work at all periods in the election cycle. This means the full impact of political incentives on DA behavior may be larger than what is found in this project alone. So much work on criminal justice reform to date has focused on improvement to the criminal justice system itself and to the laws that govern it. If political incentives and the harshness of sentencing have in fact declined in response to public sentiment, then this project highlights that focusing on hearts and minds, on shifting public opinion toward punishment, may prove beneficial in changing sentencing outcomes and stemming mass incarceration. Thank you very much. I welcome comments and feedback you may have.
Thanks, Chika. So there is a Q&A feature in Zoom.
Quick question, wondering who was in the data that showed that the sentiment pre-1994 thought it wasn't harsh enough? Is there any sampling bias that you know of, or how was the data collected? So the General Social Survey is representative at the national level. And so they sample individuals from all 50, from most, if not all 50 states, and then they do like a weighting to get the estimate for the national sentiments across a variety of different indicators. And so I don't think that there will be much sampling bias, at least when it comes to like the methodology that they use in constructing that survey.